What do you tend to see that they misunderstand the most, right? When they're ready to sell, everything's come to you.
I think one of the primary misunderstandings, and this is going to sound a little self-serving, is that buyers and sellers think that they can DIY an acquisition.
And you're still seeing that same kind of flow from the banks.
There are deals that were eligible a year and a half ago that are no longer eligible.
So welcome to Ask Frank, where in 15 minutes we have an expert answer one of our audience members' questions. And today we're really lucky to have Scott Oliver, partner at Lewis Kappes in Indianapolis and one of the most active SBA closing attorneys in the country. Scott sits in the last chair before money moves on a small business acquisition. So welcome to Ask Frank.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, our question's from a gentleman called Earl in Texas, who's 64 and he's a general contractor. His business is doing around 3.5 million. And, this is his retirement, right? He wants to sell in 36 months. So, I guess let's set the scene. And I think the best place to start is with you. Like, what is a closing attorney? What do you do? Where do you sit in the chain? What's your role?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And my role is a bit unique because I work for most of the top SBA lenders in the country who are providing the financing to the small businesses. More specifically, I do a lot of acquisitions. So my clients are the ones who have customers who are purchasing the seller's business. So when I'm involved in these transactions, most of my job has to do with regulatory compliance with SBA transactions, because SBA deals are very different from the conventional world and require a lot of knowledge about specific rules and regulations that are continuously changing. So at the very core of what I'm doing, I'm protecting the bank and the bank's guarantee. All right, because they are government guaranteed loans to these borrowers, the buyers of the seller's business. But a lot of what we do outside of the regulation side is we're the deal quarterbacks. So when SBA departments at banks and lenders engage third-party counsel, they're not just engaging me, they're engaging my entire department of lawyers, of paralegals, of closing assistants, of title order specialists, of post-closing teams, so that we're working with those banks to get the deals to the closing table, compliant with the SBA regulations, but also working with the buyers, with the sellers, with their respective attorneys, title companies, escrow companies, what have you, to make sure that that deal actually closes and closes properly. Now that could be, a 20-minute, 30-minute spiel, which I'm not going to bore you all with, but I'd be happy to answer any specific questions about that role. But it is on behalf of the lender, not the buyer, not the seller, but the lender.
And so, representing the lender then, what do you tend to see that they misunderstand the most, right? When they're ready to sell, everything's come to you, like, you're working for these guys. What is it that you're seeing they misunderstand or they've got wrong?
I think one of the primary misunderstandings, and this is going to sound a little self-serving, is that buyers and sellers think that they can DIY an acquisition.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Usually when I'm, between $2 million, $5 million acquisitions, counsel is kind of a shoo-in. But a lot of times, if it's below that $2 million threshold, or even if it is between that 2 and 5, buyers and sellers will say, I don't need counsel. I'm going to use ChatGPT, or I'm not going to use counsel. My brother's ex-fiance, something, family law attorney is going to put this together for me using a form, right? In those situations, I get it. It's all well and good. We like to save money. We like to find the easy way, but they don't understand that these transactions, while there is a finish line for the closing, can have real consequences that can impact both the seller and the buyer long term that they might not catch unless they have counsel involved. And now from where I sit, I see this all the time, but because I am representing the banks and the lenders, I don't provide specific counsel to the buyers and sellers. So when I see a document come through that, maybe it, meets muster with respect to the SBA regulations, if they have an attorney involved, they could have structured it differently for tax savings. They could structure it differently so that it is eligible. They could structure it differently so that there is actually a defined plan leading up to closing, following closing, so that that seller gets what that seller wanted, so that buyer gets the support that he or she needs, so that the transaction is set up for success at the outset, rather than running into these issues after the fact.
And then, if you're drilling into one of those, right? So, what does the bank like to see when they're looking at these businesses? Because if we take this gentleman from Texas, my assumption is he's still working inside the business. And so, is that going to kill a deal? Does it restructure it? Does it kind of force some type of repricing? Like, what happens there?
Yeah, it really depends on the specifics of the deal structure, right?
Yeah.
Because if my clients are involved, they're working with the borrower, the buyer.
Yeah.
Your individual who asked this question is the seller. Now, does that mean that the seller is kind of off the table and doesn't matter in the acquisition side of things from a lender's perspective? Absolutely not. They're still going to be talking with the buyer and saying, okay, buyer, you're buying this business. Here are what the numbers look like. Here's what the business plan looks like. Here are the current employees. How does the transition happen? But a lot of times they're also thinking about, what's the age of the seller? Why is the seller selling the business? Is the seller going to sell the business and try to turn around and compete with that buyer? Is the seller retiring? There are a lot of different pieces to that puzzle that lenders are going to be looking at. And quite frankly, the buyer and the buyer's attorney should be looking at as well. I believe you said the individual that reached out is looking to retire, and this is essentially his retirement plan, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So that's usually a pretty good green flag for a lender because you're not worried about that situation. You said his name was Earl, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Where Earl is going to sell his business and then turn around and say, I'm not done yet. I have a loyal client base. I'm going to set up shop 5 miles down the road and I'm going to compete with the buyer. Or I'm going to sell my business and I want to stay on in a pivotal role, making $200,000 a year as an employee. Well, surprise here, that's not SBA eligible under most circumstances. And in most situations, that's something that's going to cause a lot of friction for the buyer and quite possibly make the deal ineligible for SBA financing.
So then, I mean, in that case, you talked about either Earl staying on, but again, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, there is the position from the banks as well to start looking at, things like seller notes, right? For holding either, the seller in for 12 to 24 months, I guess. Like how common is that?
It's very common. The seller financing side of things, that's incredibly common. I'll start at the very beginning with the seller staying on because there's some nuance here.
Yeah.
In most acquisitions, unless it's a partial change in ownership, the seller can only remain as a consultant for a period not to exceed 12 months. It's essentially the SBA's way of saying if a seller sells his or her business, the seller sells his or her business.
Yeah, you can't
exits.
Yeah.
That 12-month period is actually pretty important because a lot of times the buyers want the seller to stay on. Earl may know people, may know the systems, the structures, and be able to really help that buyer during those first 12 months. But afterwards, if it was a complete change sale or a change in ownership, Earl would then transition out of the business after that period of time. Now, with seller notes, that is involvement in a way because the seller has skin in the game for a long period of time. Right. It doesn't mean that they're working in the business or anything like that. But if they bought the business and a portion of that was paid with the seller note, the seller has an interest in getting paid back. Right. You don't want a seller to be in a situation where the buyer that used the seller note stops paying on it. When you structure an SBA transaction, there's a lot of considerations there because you can have seller notes used as what's called equity injection in the transaction if that seller note is on full standby and fully subordinated for the term of the SBA loan. And in business acquisitions, that's usually 120 months, 10 years, but it's the full term of the SBA loan. The 24-month standby that you referred to is not incorrect. It's just older information because the SOP changed. Those are the regulations that dictate how these deals are structured. But if it's not being used as equity injection for the borrower, say it's just truly a seller note, then the terms are approved by the lender. So, I just did a deal earlier this morning. I prepped a standby agreement for it. And that standby agreement allowed payments immediately on the seller note, unless the lender's loan is in default. But that all depends on how the deal is structured. That would not be eligible if the parties were trying to use that seller note as part of the 10% injection requirement.
And if I understand as well, there's also been some changes to the SBA legislation around, how other investors in those businesses can be viewed, right? Like there's almost like a look through now where if that business does default, those investors that have also participated, they can also either have, the SBA relationship, ruined going forward, or, that can also impact them, right? Has that come into effect?
That's actually really, it's funny that you bring that up. That is a very recent hot topic that's being discussed. As of right now, yes, I believe if you have the full ownership cap table entered into what's called ETRAN, it's the system for SBA loans, and there is then a default at a future date by that borrower who had those investors are going to get flagged. Now, I can't I can't speculate on this because there's been nothing officially released about it. I'm not sure that that is how it will be viewed forever down the road. It's hard for me to think that a 1% angel investor on a transaction could be impacted for essentially life for default, where that person just provided capital to a business. But again, I'm not at liberty to be able to go into that detail, and I don't know the answer. But that is something that's really concerning a lot of investors right now, because the investor side of deal work and structuring has been really under the radar, especially in the last year and a half or so, to make sure that these types of deals are compliant, are eligible, and that parties aren't getting in a situation where the SBA says, no, that's not an eligible deal, and you have a real issue on your hands.
And I guess, just the last one, across all the acquisitions and, the SBA work that you've seen and you've watched die at the closing table, is there one preventable reason that you see, like, is there anything that you see and you just think, like, I wish I could have told you, 12 or 24 months ago to maybe change something?
I would say clarity and communication early and often is the biggest thing. Very blessed and happy and proud to be able to say that not very many deals that I see die at the closing table. If they die earlier, and that's how we want it. The parties want it too. But it's usually because at LOI, for the letter of intent or the purchase agreement initial drafts, the parties aren't clear about what they can and can't do, what they're willing and not willing to do. You use seller notes as an example. If a borrower goes to a bank and says, I'm going to structure this and I'm going to take, 5% of my equity injection is going to be in a seller note, and the seller doesn't know that that seller's not getting paid for 10 years, and that comes out at the closing table, you best bet that Earl or whoever is on
He's
that
walking
side
away.
is probably going to have a problem.
Yeah.
But that happens more often than you might think if lenders don't have third-party counsel involved. I'm sounding like an advertisement, right? But if that stuff is not brought up early and talked through at those initial stages, those types of SBA restrictions become barriers to closing. Whereas if at the outset, the buyer and seller are aware, this is the SBA, this is the sandbox that we have to play in, these are the rules that we have to follow, let's do it. That type of structure, that type of deal and communication, you're going to close, and you're going to close well and hopefully smoothly, unless, of course, there are 1,000 other variables, but the issue won't be the SBA.
Yeah. I mean, so, I guess if I'm to summarize that, right, it's engage counsel early. I guess, it's always cheaper when you engage early, right? Because you're not mopping up the mistakes later on, and then almost pull together like your own internal term sheet that lines up against the SBA qualifications to say, like, this is what I can get away with, aligned with, how I want to sell the business or buy the business, right?
Yeah, and when I'm talking about counsel too, I'm not talking about myself. If I'm representing the banks, I'm already there no matter what on the deal transaction. But having a buyer or having a seller who is represented makes the deals go smoother. There's a higher certainty to close. I'm much better in a position to be able to speak with those attorneys and get the thing to the closing table quickly, and without the friction that would cost additional money. On the other side of that, you want to think of the practical end, which is every attorney's, hill that they want to die on, is you get a transaction that is structured properly so that you don't hit the closing table and it's all sunshine and rainbows. And then 2 weeks down the road, you're saying, well, crap, I didn't account for that. I didn't have proper indemnities. I didn't have this structured the way that I wanted to. Then you're kind of not in a situation where you can do much about it. If you have those lawyers, those people, your village, your deal team at the beginning, not only is that deal structured well, your future intact, but you have somebody to go to as you start to scale that business, as you exit that business years down the road, what have you. That is invaluable. And the number that you put to that is much, much more valuable than any legal bill that you're going to get from that particular small business closing.
And maybe just on like the SBA that you're saying, and I know that we're kind of outside, but are you seeing the same level of deal flow as you were seeing, this time last year? Like, is there still that same appetite to be leveraging the SBA from the banks? No, just from the banks. I guess, what I'm reading about this topic, to the earlier point around, cap tables and penalizing everyone on that cap table, and then some moves that are happening by the government to either reduce down, is it still being the kind of the number one tool that the banks are trying to leverage, and you're still seeing that same kind of flow from the banks?
I say it's relatively similar.
Yeah.
Banks that did it properly initially are still continuing to do it properly. Is there some level of credit tightening? I would say yes, just because there are deals that were eligible a year and a half ago that are no longer eligible. There are deals where maybe a lender might not be in that industry or want to take that level of risk, where a couple years ago, maybe they would have, and now they say no. But a lot of what we see in terms of differences in deals is, the citizenship requirements. We haven't touched that. It's a whole different topic, but there's been a change where green card holders cannot be in the cap table anywhere. That didn't used to be the case. So, I mean, that takes a certain number of deals off the table for people who used to be eligible for SBA financing